Good evening, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming. This is the first event, hopefully, of many. I think we're joined here for the first event by Iain Thomson. Iain Thomson was studied famously under Hubert Dreyfus. He's a continental philosopher, famous for bringing Heidegger over to the English-speaking world. He studied under him at Berkeley. And he got his PhD at UC San Diego. And I also found out recently that he actually studied with Jacques Derrida at UC Irvine as well, which is quite interesting. He's now a professor at University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and he's known for his contributions to Heidegger, about education, art, literature, technology, and ecology. So his key books, his first one, this is Ontology, Technology and the Politics of Education, 2005. Is Heidegger, Art and Postmodernity, which is in 2011. And Rethinking Death in and After Heidegger, 2024. And his latest work, which will be majority of the discussion today, which is Heidegger on the Danger and Promise in the Age of AI. If you can just welcome him, give a bit of a round of applause. Thanks for coming here. Brilliant. Okay, so I'm just going to start off with a simple question, and since you focus mostly on Heidegger, could you just tell me why? You know, what is it about him as a thinker that is drawn to him?
I like his Nazism.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be a super shocking answer, I guess, coming from America today. But no, that's it. I actually did not know he was a Nazi when I first fell in love with his thinking. So back in 1987, I think it was, I took a course on the later Heidegger with Hubert Dreyfus, as you mentioned, my teacher at Berkeley, and he did a 2-sequence course on early and then later Heidegger, and I took it out of order. I did later before early. And I learned later when I took the early Heidegger that on the first day he talks about Heidegger's Nazism. So if you take it in the right sequence, you get the appropriate warning. But I took the later Heidegger, so I didn't know. Pre-internet. You know everything, everybody instantly. And I fell in love. I was into poetry. There's my grandfather and my father both wrote poetry, and the idea that poetry was more meaningful than science seemed right to me, but I'd never heard a philosopher defend that view. They always seemed more scientific and kind of boring. So it was that idea, and the fact that I really, unlike a lot of people, I really loved his writing style and found it illuminating and interesting. And I'm a very slow reader, so for me, I have to read, like, for it to be worthwhile for me, I need to read things that reward slow reading. Nietzsche talks about the art of slow reading and how philosophers have to learn that. Speed reading is an oxymoron in philosophy. And Heidegger really rewards that. So I felt like it turned out when I got into class that I felt like I understood Heidegger better than the other. Most people were like, I don't understand this at all. And it didn't seem that difficult to me. So I always think that's a kind of a good situation when you find yourself able to understand something that other people like you think is important, but can't really understand. So then you find yourself in the position of being able to help explain it to them. And that kind of became my career.
Yeah. So I think you mentioned, was it Thomas Jefferson was your first love, and that you were sort of put off by some facts about him, and then you had to reevaluate your position, but you said you wasn't going to lose the same with Heidegger, is that correct?
Yeah, that was back in high school. I was in love with a black woman, and I'm reading Jefferson, and he's such a beautiful writer, and writing about freedom in ways that, moved me to tears. And then I found out later he had slaves, and I just couldn't grok how this guy could think so eloquently about freedom and while having slaves. It made no sense to me. And it was like a traumatic impasse in thinking that I couldn't get very far on. But with Heidegger, I spent, a couple decades trying to understand how the greatest thinker of the 20th century could have fallen for the most heinous political movement thus far. Sadly, I'm worried that we're going to beat it. But, it's, and so that was my first book. Before me, people had kind of settled into this um, attempt to cordon off Heidegger the man from Heidegger the thinker as a way to not have to deal with his Nazism. But that's a completely untenable and insulting move for a great philosopher, as Gadamer, one of Heidegger's students, said. I mean, philosophy literally means love of Sophia. Sophia is practical knowledge. That's knowledge that guides your everyday life, your practical life. So how could you love life-guiding wisdom and not live by it? That makes no sense. So a philosopher that doesn't live by their own thinking is not really a philosopher. So to say Heidegger's thought bared no relationship to his politics, his political life, was in fact obviously false to anyone who's reading him carefully. And I think once you see that there are philosophical reasons for what he did, then it becomes much more interesting question of what of his views remain important and insightful today and tomorrow, and which ones need to be chucked into the wastebasket of history, with a flourish. That was the first book back in 2005. So I think I was one of the first people to say Heidegger's philosophy is directly connected to his Nazism, and here's how. And that's not the end of the story. That's the beginning of the story. Now, that doesn't mean, I think especially today, people like to be righteous and imagine that if you do something terrible, you're a terrible person. But that's not a realistic view about humans. Humans do terrible and great things mixed together, and especially the great ones. Almost all the great humans are terrible humans in various ways. It's a hard truth about human nature, and the question then becomes, how do you work through that? How do you deal with that? Because you're never gonna. The idea that there's a saint, like a sinless person, is a Christian fantasy.
So, well, it's quite. I'm glad that you open with his politics first. It saves a lot of ambiguity. But so how do you? Last question about it is how did you rectify it? Obviously you don't take the same points as Wallin or Emmanuel Faye. So what parts have you managed to chuck out, and what parts did you think were valuable, worth keeping?
Well, that's a complicated story, but Bai is not really a serious philosopher, in my opinion. He's his father was one of the first anti-Heidegger guys, and he's still trying to vindicate his father, I think. I don't want to go, my father's a psychiatrist, so I have a tendency to go psychoanalytic in these things, but his work is not very sensitive to what Heidegger's saying. So he just thinks Heidegger's work should be put in the same section of the library as Hitler's Mein Kampf, and you got to show your 18-year-old or 21-year-old card or whatever it is to be able to check the books out, because they're dangerous and they'll contaminate your mind and turn you into a Nazi. That logic of contagion is the same paranoid logic the Nazis used to murder people. The idea that people were contaminating the gene pool was why they were, that motivated a lot of the worst politics. So I don't believe in the logic of contagion. I think people, or at least smart people, are capable of thinking for themselves. So for me, Wallin is a serious guy. I was friends with him. My first job was at Rice University, and he was a nice guy. But he's a Habermasian, and Habermas is just kind of a straight Democrat, which I respect. But it's not very sophisticated. It's not capable really of taking the measure of democracy. Is great, but how do you deal with democracy in the age of technology? We've seen how technocrats can buy elections and convince people to vote against their own interests and win elections. I think just saying people need to have, the Habermas line is, you have to have a democratic speech situation that's egalitarian and unbiased and all that sort of thing. That doesn't help. So it's that view is been rendered obsolete by by the tradition. So if you actually look at Heidegger's heritage, for me, it's complicated because he had an influence in Iran on right-wing stuff, in Russia on Dugin, right-wing apologists for Putin. But in the West, his main influence is on people like Derrida, and Foucault, and Deleuze, and
Yeah.
Simone de Beauvoir.
Yeah.
And these are left-wing philosophers. So if there was a straight connection between Heidegger and being a Nazi, then the right would be left. The right would be correct that the left is a bunch of fascists, which I don't believe.
Yeah, so he's seen as being not racist, but anti-modern and anti. I don't think he's multiculti. I think that's fair to say. Is that correct?
It's complicated. He was very open to Japan. He was, but Japan was on the same side of the war as the Nazis. But he had this guy Count Kuki was in his classes in the 1920s, and Kuki went on to start the Kyoto School. So if you know anything about Japanese philosophy, the Kyoto School is one of the most interesting and most talked about contemporary movements in the West. That gets talked about in the West from Japan, because they kind of blended Eastern and Western thinking.
Nishitani.
Was it Nishitani and a few others, yeah?
Nishitani and Nishida was the generation before that. And the thinking of nothingness as a kind of emptiness, that is like, emptiness is really a word for like fullness. So the idea that reality is ultimately empty, but that means it's actually incredibly full, is a Western Buddhistic idea. It comes out of Zen Buddhism, and it seems very closely aligned to Heidegger. So these people saw Heidegger as someone who was working on a project that was useful for them. They ended up being kind of apologists, some of them for Imperial Japan, so they have their own problems.
Right.
Heidegger's view was something like there's three great origins of philosophy. It's India, China, and Greece. And the problems of the West are indigenous problems to the Western tradition. They come out of our particular way of doing philosophy. So for us, philosophy is metaphysics. That is, it's an attempt to give an exhaustive account of all reality. And insofar as these other traditions don't do that, they're not philosophy. And Eastern people get offended when Heidegger says things like Eastern philosophy is not philosophy. But for him, that's a compliment, not an insult, because philosophy is bad. Philosophy for Heidegger is metaphysics, and he calls his later work thinking. Right. Thinking is a deceptively simple honorific for the idea of a post-metaphysical philosophy.
Yeah. So that's what you focused on your first book, Ontology. And I think before I get onto that, or in fact, maybe if you could say something briefly about that, I'd like to talk about the philosophical inheritance that he'd got with Descartes and what he was rejecting. But if you could say briefly just about ontotheology. And I think talking to my friends about it, and what they wanted to understand was whether it did really start with Plato, or whether it was in Thales, even from Thales and Anaximander from the start, or or if in the East, for instance, if their philosophy, because they didn't have that the beginnings of science and things like that, that they didn't go down that path.
I'm not an expert on Eastern philosophy, though my colleagues here at UNM, several of them are, especially Buddhism, and we argue a lot about, because both Heidegger and Nietzsche are very critical of especially Nietzsche, who thinks Buddhism is nihilism, but my colleagues don't like that. But yeah, so my reading is that ontotheology goes back to Thales and Anaximander. So at the very beginning of the Western tradition, is the question, what is the arche? And the arche is hard to translate, but it means something like the ultimate foundation of reality, like the final ground of all things.
It comes from architecture, is it? That's the root of the term architecture, is that it? Or archaeology?
Archaeology is a good one, because then you're looking for the origin. So it's something like Thales thought his answer to the question, what is the arche, is water. The arche is water. And Aristotle thought, well, that sounds stupid. How could how could you think everything's made out of water? But it's really an incredibly deep insight to say, look, all that period diverse stuff, it's all made out of the same thing. Like deep down at the lowest level, it's all composed of a single element. It's not really water, but that's ontology.
What did they mean though? Because obviously this is pre-Plato, so the pre-Socratics, they weren't materialists, were they? So how was it that they approached these questions?
Well, Aristotle reads them as materialists very influentially, but yeah, I don't really think they're. I think you can hear water as a kind of materialist answer, like reality is ultimately made up of some stuff, we call it substance now, but that's an Aristotle word. Aristotle coined hule or ousia, matter or substance. And that's something like what substance, what stands beneath, substance, what stands beneath everything else. But in Thales, it's this this sense that ultimately beneath everything else, everything's one. Parmenides had a similar idea. But then you get Thales' student, and these are both, by the way, in Turkey, the west coast of Turkey. So Western philosophy is born in Turkey.
The Milesians, is it?
And it's geographically complicated. But so Thales' student Anaximander asks the same question as his teacher: what's the arche? What's the ultimate foundation of reality? And his answer is aperon, where peros is like a perimeter, around a house, and the alpha privative in Greek is like un or not. So unlimited, you can't put a fence around it, like it's don't fence me in. The aperon, it gets translated as the indefinite or the infinite. But it's this, and he's got the oldest line in Western philosophy because Aristotle passed it down, where he says something like, everything comes from aperon, to which it returns when it ceases to be, in accordance with Moira, fate, who bound all things to happen in this way in accordance with justice, decay. So it's this idea that the universe is just, and it's just that everything die, that everything cease to be. And when it ceases to be, it goes back whence it came, to the infinite or the indefinite. So that answer looks something like, for Heidegger, I think it's a theological answer. It's like saying everything came from the infinite. It comes into a finite form. You and me, all of us, we're all finite beings. But in being finite, we've betrayed the source. We've violated the infinite source from which we come. So when we die, death is like the payback for the crime of existing. So the cosmic register balances out when you die, because you do the time for the crime of taking on finite form. So the whole universe is just, but it's a very different view of the ultimate foundation. It's more theological. It's like trying to get outside the existing reality and see what's beyond it. So then Plato combines those two ways of thinking, where you're trying to get to the innermost core of things and the outermost perspective. And that's why he's the first metaphysician or ontotheologist, because he's doing both.
Before we do get onto the context of being and time, could you just briefly sort of break that down? Because it is the path that we've been set on with our ontotheology built into the West, or is it built into the structure of reality itself? So is it a Western tradition, or is it part of
That's Western. I mean, it's possible some Eastern person might say, it turns out that Buddhism is the same, that Buddhism tries to find the innermost core of reality, like the tiniest building blocks everything's made out of, and it tries to get outside everything and take up this God's eye view on the totality of all things, and it combines those two into a single system. And if that's true, then it's an ontotheology. But I've never had anyone in 30 years argue that to me. It doesn't seem preposterous to me, but I've never had anyone say that that's actually the case. So it does seem like that from what I know about, like Zen and stuff, that doesn't seem like the view at all. So maybe the Buddhism that's in the background of Zen believes something. But for Heidegger, it's a problem we created for ourselves from our way of understanding the foundation of all things. And there's a phenomenological question there, which is something like, why did we do that? Like, what was it about humans, 2,700 years ago, or whatever the hell this was, that made them think like that the deepest foundations of reality were deep down below us and way high above us? And I try and show that Heidegger worried about that question in his later work, and the answer is something like, my best guess at least is something like, because we stand on the earth and we look up at the sky. And in the ancient world, they thought the sky was like water. A lot, not all of them, but like the Hebrews thought the sky was water. If you read about like the flood, when God floods the earth to punish the disobedient humans, he just like cuts a hole in the sky and all the water that's out there pours in. It's kind of terrifying vision of like purging everything.
Okay, so can we fast forward now to Descartes and Montaigne and the beginning of the subject-object? Because I think you've given a nice grounding of the history of philosophy. But now to the point where I think Charles Taylor talks quite a lot about this, the gradual move to inwardness. I think I remember Dreyfus mentioning St. Jerome was being one of the first persons where people would come from thousands of miles to watch him read the Bible without his lips moving. And what they would be seeing there for the first time, instead of reaching out into the world like Plato and Aristotle, is the inner life of the individual. And not that the inner life never existed, because it obviously existed in Achilles and in the Homeric gods, but it was never given that priority that we're given now.
I'm so glad you brought up that example. It's one of my favorite examples. But I wonder if it's true that Achilles had an inner life. Like you said, it was obvious that Achilles had an inner life, but I think it seems obvious to us that everyone's just like us. Like that's what Richard Rorty thought. Like if you could go back into ancient Greece and speak Greek, you'd be talking to people who are pretty much just like us. But the idea of historicity is the idea that Hegel starts, which is that our very deepest understanding of reality changes dramatically over time. So you can't just go back and assume people in the distant past are going to be just like us. They're not. They are really different, and we would be really different to them. They would think we were super weird, just like we would think they're super weird. So in the case of Achilles, you never see that guy have a thought that he doesn't say, right? Like when he gets mad, he starts fighting people and throws a fit. He never is mad and doesn't talk about it, like sulks or something. So he seems like a kind of a good example of someone who's a candidate for someone with zero inner life. Though he tries to hide, I guess, when Odysseus wants to recruit him to war, right? He dresses as a woman. Like I think Odysseus throws a ball. I forget the exact way he catches. He catches him by doing something where he responds in a way that only a woman would, or only a man would respond. So he's busted by his inability to think about gender norms, basically. So, but Odysseus, who's like the hero of the Odyssey, if that's the kind of follow-up to the Iliad, the Trojan War story, is the evidence that he's this great genius, the favorite of Athena, this god of wisdom, is that he can pretend to cry, while inside he remains unmoved like bone. So he has a split between the inside and the outside in that he can pretend to cry, but every 2-bit actor can do that now, right?
Because he was setting the example, wasn't he? Well, all these men were crying on the outside. He was the one that withdrew when they were memorizing the battles that were gone. So he does have an inner life, doesn't he?
It's rare and astounding and amazing. And then fast forward, as you said, 2,000 years, And you get St. Anselm, this guy who could read without moving his lips, which I assume everybody there can do now. Imagine people walking thousands of miles to watch you read because you're not moving your lips while you read. And being like, oh my God, is he really reading? How does he do it without talking really quietly? So there's a progressive development of an internal space of consciousness. And Descartes, in the Heideggerian story, is the big influence. Like Dreyfus used to say, the most influential people in the history of the West are Jesus and Descartes.
Right.
So Descartes turns us all into egos. He turns us all into like subjects, where we say things like, "Oh, well, that's just subjective." Almost nothing is just subjective. That's a complete bullshit. Like,
But
yeah.
It's a very difficult point to get into, because I think David Foster Wallace is an example in one of his lectures that it's like trying to explain water to a fish, because you've got these thoughts, you've got pictures of yourself all the time, you confront who you are, so it's almost impossible, unless you really read history and really struggle with these things, to actually picture it. One thing, that there was a program in the UK called Tribes. My housemate showed it me, and I can't remember the geezer, but he was in South America, and he went and spoke to some tribes, and they were obsessed with his video camera because it had a flip thing, and they could see their own reflection, and they'd never ever seen that. And mirrors, ironically, were, I think, they're 6,000 years old, but they were only mass produced and produced so that they could actually really reflect in the 18th century, and it's about the right time of Descartes. So people only saw things in the world in relevance to other people or to the community, and not to them as an individual. So could you try and sort of get that across and see?
I think the claim is not that you don't have an inner life that's different from other people's and that's private to you and stuff. We all do, unless we're complete sociopaths or something. Maybe them especially. I don't know. But we all do. So philosophy did that. The idea is that philosophy isn't just this weird thing that people in their ivory towers do that doesn't bear on everyday life. Philosophy transforms the world fundamentally by reshaping our deepest and most taken for granted presuppositions about what it means to be. So in the case of Descartes, he makes us think that what it means to be a self is to be a conscious thinker who puts things in words and like makes propositional or sentential claims about things, like, that is my wife, she loves me. Whereas in fact, if you think about what it's like to live with somebody, 99% of the time you're not thinking of it in that way. You're engaged with them. Or if you're good at any skill, that's the example Dreyfus uses a lot. Good at any skill, like riding a bike or playing a sport. There's a dangerous moment in playing a sport where you can be like, oh, I'm playing really well today. That's a dangerous thought, because if you're out on the field and you think, oh, I'm playing great today, you're now getting in your head. And part of what's making you play great is that you're not in your head. So there's this danger that you're going to start analyzing yourself, and that's going to undermine your performance. They actually have a word for this in baseball, where like these pitchers who used to be able to, throw strikes all the time suddenly can't hit the strike zone. They call it like the yips. And the yips are basically when you're stuck in your head. You're analyzing yourself and you can't perform at the highest level. So this view of ourselves, the Heideggerian point is not that it's false, but that it's secondary and derived, and it comes from a more primordial, calls it the usual and everyday way in which we are, we're not separated off from all the things in the world standing over against them. That's Gegenstand, that's object with German. We're not standing over against all this stuff in the world. Rather, it's part of our world. So like if I'm riding a bike, my bike isn't some object that I'm standing over against, having thoughts about. It's part of the like living world that I am, as is the road, as are the traffic conditions, you know. And it's only when you're first learning some skillful activity that it strikes you as like a thing outside your consciousness. So I think we all have the experience of, you know, the fish in water skill. We have this skillful engagement with things that isn't like a highly cognitive, thematized relation filled with words. But the, you know, philosophy makes us think in the beginning of modern philosophy, the 1700s, that's the fundamental relation to reality, and that does a lot of damage, not just to our ability to understand ourselves, but it's both powerful and negative. Like it gives us science, but it also like gives us environmental devastation and objectification.
Yeah. And so Descartes was the first person to, because he was just responding to skepticism. He wanted to find out that one thing that he could prove without a doubt is that he exists, because if he didn't exist, then he couldn't be doubting, could he? And so that he found that foundation. And so it was really a response to cynicism, not cynicism, skepticism. But yeah, so that tradition, that subject-object tradition, carried through to Wolff, Leibniz, Hegel, Kant, and Husserl, and it was Heidegger that finally was the one high-powered enough to throw off that whole tradition. So could you talk about how he did that, and you know, how he approached that, and maybe some of the context at the time?
Yeah, I would say he was the one low-powered enough to throw off that tradition, because he was like a poor kid, you know, from a tiny village, and
so I was quoting Dreyfus, actually. It was an exact quote from Dreyfus. What you go on?
That's funny, because like one of the things Dreyfus used to say in class was, okay, you students who are just here new at the university who haven't had a bunch of philosophy, I really want to hear from you, because your minds haven't been corrupted by philosophy yet. Once you've read a bunch of philosophy, you're very quick to like, oh, that sounds like this. And you start, you know, giving these ready-made answers instead of describing the way you actually experience it. So phenomenology, which is Heidegger's, I mean, Husserl, well, Hegel, you can say, who's the first phenomenologist? The word gets, I think, coined by Kant. There's a little section in the first critique, but it's like 10 pages long. And it's a call for a historical understanding of the categories we use to make sense of the world. And then Hegel writes the phenomenology of spirit or mind, Geist. And that's a story about the historical categories that Kant basically seems to assume are ahistorical. He's like Chomsky, thinks there's like these fixed neural structures that are basically unchanged for all human beings everywhere. And Hegel's the guy who says, no, they're dramatically different, and they emerge from different peoples at different times and in response to particular problems and situations. And Descartes is the point you made about, he's asking, what can I know for certain? How do I put science, philosophy how do I make philosophy into a science? How do I put it on a firm foundation? He says, what can I know beyond a shadow of a doubt? What's the unshakable foundation of all things? And he says, simplifying, the only thing I can't doubt is that I'm thinking. Because even if I doubt that I'm thinking, doubting is a kind of thinking. So the doubt confirms the very thing it's trying to doubt. Now, what's interesting about that is it's a phenomenological proof. You know, it's like it's you showing yourself something, showing yourself that you can't doubt that thinking is happening. It's not even this guy in this body, am thinking. It's more like this thought exists. This thought that I take myself to be exists. And so there's a kind of like fundamental. That's the cogito. So ego cogito is I think. Cogito is just thinking. So what you can't doubt is thinking. Like that's the foundation after Kant. I mean after Descartes. And Kant is the huge big. He's like the most influential philosopher since Plato. And Kant just takes that idea that thinking is the foundation of all things, and makes that the foundation of ethics, politics, and aesthetics. So in ethics, I can only do what all other thinking beings can do without contradiction. In politics, the job of the state is to protect the free realm in which each thinking subject, rational agent, as he calls it, is entitled to as much freedom as is compatible with every other rational agent having that much freedom. And in aesthetics, art is an object created by a subject for the subjective appreciation of other subjects. And so he just, in Heidegger's terms, Kant thinks Descartes' unthought. He just takes this radical foundational thought to its fullest conclusions in all these fields of philosophy. And then Nietzsche is the crucial figure who comes and thinks Kant's unthought. That's the death of God. And then this is later Heidegger. So, but you asked about being in time. So the being in time story is just to think about like what it's like when you ride your bike and how you can't do justice to that from the perspective of like this Cartesian subject standing over against a world of objects and analyzing it. That's how you look at your bike when it's broken and you don't know how to fix it. That's not how it is when you're riding.
So that Heidegger reverses the cogito. He puts the ergo sum cogito, that first before you think that you must exist. Could you just flesh out his idea then of the fact that you're being in the world before that you have any conscious thoughts about something, and that even your identity and your thoughts, and for example, I don't think in a language that is completely my own. I think in a language that's been provided for me by the culture that I'm in, and that I become not attuned, but I become let's just say attuned to that culture, and I developed it in an understanding way.
So Heidegger takes the Hegelian thought that you're shaped by the world much more than you shape the world. So he takes that over, and he takes over the thought from Kierkegaard, this religious thinker, that individuality is an achievement. It's not something you don't start off as an individual. You start off as a kind of member of the group, and you're doing what one does in your society. In our society, we're all variations on different themes. So you try and do what someone like you would do in that situation. That's what Nietzsche calls the herd. Kierkegaard calls it the public. Heidegger calls it das Mann, the one, the anonymous anyone. And, so, you don't make up the idea that if you need to get to the pub, you can walk, take a bus, ride a bike, drive a car. There's just like fixed options or now call an Uber, call a Lyft, take a robo-taxi. There's just fixed options in our society about how to do that. And if you try and do it in a really weird way, it won't work. So there's a certain amount of like background conformity that humans rely on in order to get along together.
Yeah, because in England, if you get in a lift, you can't look at the other person. You've got to look at the floor, and you press the lift, and you don't say anything. And sometimes we actually say thank you. Sometimes it was just out of the blue. They've not been operating the levers, but I guess that says.
Famous psychologist named Goffman, and Goffman recommends various psychological experiments like getting on the elevator and turning around so your back's to the door and just staring at everybody. Be disruptive. It like freaks everybody out.
Yeah.
But we didn't invent those behaviors in our mind, do we? They're in the world.
And as Dreyfus used to say, like if you get a person from a Scandinavian country and a person from an African country in a cocktail party, the person from the African country will back the person from the Scandinavian country up because they have different senses of the appropriate standing distance for cocktail parties. And for the Scandinavian person, it's further, and for the African person, it's closer. And these aren't things we understand. Like we stand under them. They shape us. You only notice it if somebody points it out to you. And there's a million examples, but the big critique of being in time, the big argument that he's making is that in the first half of the book. The second half is the death stuff, but the first and time. But the first half is the critique of Cartesian dualism. So he's just saying that this move that Descartes made that said reality is made of two different kinds of things. Forget God for a sec. There's a third kind. But there's basically objects and subjects. There's consciousness and materiality. And that dichotomy, everything's one or the other, has shaped all thinking since then and largely to this day. And it's wrong. The more basic level at which we exist is not split off like that. We are part of a world. We're open to others. We're shaped by others. Our reality, they were already there before we were, and we take over a bunch of that in various ways. And there can be these authentic moments where you can achieve individuality and take a stand on yourself. But that's an achievement, and not everybody does that. You can go through life without ever doing that. And it doesn't make you an ethically better person. You can be an authentic Nazi. Yeah. So it's not an ethical norm. It's just like, have you owned your own life? Have you taken responsibility for this existence that you are? Where existence means existere, standing out into an intelligible world that you constitute in part through your own understanding of it, or your own way of standing under it. Which changes.
He's not interested in values, is he? He's interested in existence. Could you...
Later, Heidegger says values are radical killing, a murdering that kills at the roots. So, like, that's his part, comes out of his critique of Nietzsche and our technological age. He thinks we're obsessed with values. We try and make everything quantifiable and give it a price. And what really matters in life is the invaluable, the stuff that you would never sell. That there's no, like, how much to torture your mom? I'll give you £1 million. And if you say no, you're not just going, I want 3 million. It's that there's no amount of money that you can give me to torture my mom. That's like that's an invaluable thing. Like, these are the touchstones around which we can build meaningful lives. So this very idea that the world's filled with values and our values are bad and we need better values is radically nihilistic for Heidegger. It's like excluding from consideration the very things we need to include to live meaningful lives, or lives that matter to us.
Before we get onto authenticity and freedom, and then I think I've got to hurry up until technology now, but could you just tell us about equipment and how it is that he thinks that we can understand the world through the use of equipment and our engaged, sort of embodied everyday world where everything's in constant flux and nothing is stable? We are sort of the arbiters of change in the world, or not if it's authentic. I suppose it's just the same, isn't it?
Yeah, it's, again, like, it's a big story, but in Being in Time, he's trying to describe the structure of this usual and ordinary mode that we're in when we're like riding bikes. So it's very hard to describe in words the structure of an existence that precedes and underlies words. But that's what he's trying to do. And he spent a lot of the 20s trying to do that. So the paradigm examples, like the workshop. His dad was a woodworker, so he uses that. But you can use any practical environment you're familiar with. So I'm like in an office. My office has a computer on it that I'm talking to you through. You're in Manchester, England, right? That blows my mind. So again, Heidegger says technology makes the near distant and the distant near. Like, you're quite physically far away from me, but right now we're very close. But the people, my family downstairs, is quite far away from me. I'm not thinking about it for the most part, except when I use them as an example. So there's not just, he says, there's no such thing as an equipment. Like, a computer by itself doesn't do anything. You need a keyboard and a mouse and a desk. And then you need, like, the context in which you use it. For me, that's philosophy. So it's like reading, writing, talking, answering emails, talking to people. And then there's all these books and places to read. So the whole thing gets set up in a way that supports a kind of embodied self-understanding of myself as a teacher, as a teacher of philosophy who has to prepare for classes and write things and respond to things. So that embodied understanding of self structures the world in which, for the most part, I live. And one day, I can wake up and be like, why did I want to be a teacher? This isn't working anymore. Like, I don't, kids today, they just want to use Chat GPT. They don't want to write anymore. I quit, and that's existential death. Like, that's when the self-understanding that's implicitly guiding and making your world intelligible stops working. And Heidegger thinks for most people that'll happen anytime you really face up to your anxiety. Because your anxiety is for him like revealing the fact that there's no right answers about what to do. But most people assume there is a right answer. Correct answer.
Yeah, and so when you're in the subject-object framework, all that is covered over. You're just seeing things as isolated things. You're not seeing the referential nexus that makes these things relevant.
Yeah, you just see a computer. You don't see like those books right there are the ones I'm using as I work on this chapter on Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche. And they're right there so that I can grab them when I need to, check that passage in German or, make sure I got the reading right.
And most of the time, you do things unconsciously, where the conscious thought is not even present, and you respond into the situation, whatever the situation demands.
And that's a kind of a Cartesian way of thinking, but we do that, right? So this is like Freud. Freud is, there's consciousness, subconsciousness, and unconsciousness. So the unconscious for us is, that's the repository of the repressed. That's like the time you walked in on your parents having sex. Remember that? Like, you can think of it for a second, but then you immediately repress it. The subconscious is like your phone number. You weren't thinking of it, but you can. And then consciousness is like your conscious thought. But all of that, that very way of thinking that all of it must be kind of propositional. And if it's not in your head, then it must be in your memory bank. And just whether it's behind like this moral paywall of the unconscious or not is the only relevant question there. For Heidegger, he did later in life trying to develop a kind of existential psychoanalysis, which instead of thinking of us as consciousnesses, thinks of us as Dasein. He thought like the task of escaping from or transcending nihilism or meaninglessness was to become Dasein. That is to like become what you are. And Dasein is like a world discloser. So you're engaged in a world that is more meaningful than you. You participate in that, and you contribute to that. But you're responsive to it, and the way you respond to it is creative. So your own individual agency does play a role. Heidegger doesn't emphasize it enough for various reasons. I'm critical of him there. But it's your own individual agency as a creator plays a role.
Oh, okay, so if we get on to the fact that you're unconcealing things and the fact that you're engaging with the world and that you're in this embodied activity, so if we move on to technology, could you explain then why there's in his essence of technology, he says firmly that there's nothing technological about technology, and maybe a bit about inframing, please, and how that interacts with how we uncover entities.
Okay, so that's a big story. I'll try and do it quickly, but what I say in the little technology book there that was free, and feel free to share it with people. I think the paperback's now like $21.
It's over there, by the way, if you're interested. Just on the plinth there to the left.
From it, there's no royalties, so I don't care. Share it. If someone doesn't need a paper copy, you should give it to them. There's about 10, 15 pages on the questions you just asked me, so I'll try and do it briefly. But what I say there is when Heidegger says the essence of technology is nothing technological, you can take that in three different ways. The first one is like just a ground clearing way where he's saying, when I say the essence of technology, don't look for like the necessary and sufficient conditions of what distinguishes technological from non-technological things. That's the analytic philosophy way. To look for necessary and sufficient. Like, is my stereo technological? What about my copy machine? What about my shoes? Are they right? You're trying to come up with like criterion or criteria that will let you distinguish technological from non-technological things. And Heidegger's view is that you can get those criteria, but that's not what thinking about the essence of technology is supposed to do. For Heidegger, this is more like Hegel. The essence of something is not what is permanent, never changes. That's the Platonic and Parmenidean way of thinking essences in the whole Western tradition. The Hegelian, Heideggerian one is the essence of something is the way it unfolds and takes shape through time. So Wesen ist gewesen, like what is what it was and is becoming. It's like, so the essence of technology for him is the understanding of what it means to be anything at all today. So it's like our fundamental understanding of what it means to be a thing in our world is technological. And then there's a final deeper essence of that that's like the salvific essence, the essence that saves us from technology. And that's just to say that if the second sense of essence, that the essence of technology is the metaphysical understanding of the being of entities, or what it means to be anything at all, well, the essence of the understanding of the being of entities is being. So the deepest essence of technology is being, which shows itself to Dasein, or us world disclosers, in various historically evolving ways over time, and can continue showing itself to us in new and different ways, so that we're not trapped within this technological one forever.
Is the fear with the technological world that eventually the hermeneutic circle will close and no new things will come open because of efficiency? Is that?
Yeah, there's a thing called he calls it the greatest danger of technology. So the greatest danger of technology is that under the influence of technology, we'll lose the ability to understand ourselves in any other way. How will that happen? Well, the way it happens most of the time is we just become so enthralled by all the cool possibilities for entertainment and distraction that technology gives us that we give up on trying to understand things in any other way. You know, we just want like ever better dating apps and video games.
As human beings, don't we naturally want things more efficient and simpler and easier? So isn't this pre-programmed into us, or does it have some sort of thing to do with the tradition, the way we approach technology? Especially if he says there's nothing technological about technology, does it imply that, because he's not anti-technological, just the same as he's not anti-science, is he?
I think that's a super deep and interesting question, because Heidegger's diagnosis is that the idea that we want everything to be more efficient is the essence of technology, right? Like, it's what I call the optimization imperative. It's we want to get the most for the least. I think if you think about the stuff that matters to you the most in your life, like spending time with the people you love, are you really trying to get the most for the least there? So the idea that there's been sort of like three fundamentally different ages in the West, that's Heidegger. And in the ancient world, he thinks the most people understood everything as physis, or translate that as nature, like physics. But what it meant to be a physical thing was to like come from nothing, emerge, peak, decline, and return to nothing. So they saw physis everywhere. Like all things have this kind of natural cycle. That's the riddle of the Sphinx. When the Sphinx asks Oedipus, you know, the original riddle's tougher, but we've simplified it. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening? There's a pile of dead bodies that she's asking that on top of because nobody's been able to answer. Why is it hard? Because we don't see that we are part of physis, that we're coming from nothing, peaking, declining, and returning to nothing. We don't see that. every day, right? It happens when you look at photographs over time, but you don't see it in the mirror every day. So, and then the Christian world, the medieval world, everything becomes like part of God's creation. So you get this fully formed structure with God at the top and Satan at the bottom, and everything's got its place within it. It doesn't change. I don't think the idea of efficiency makes a lot of sense there. Like for us, gold is valuable because it's like a finite resource or something. But for a while, it was valuable because it was useful in engineering. It was malleable to be used in all of these things. For the Christians, it was valuable because it, or was meaningful, I guess, because its shine reflected the glory of the divine or something like that. It wasn't about efficiency or value at all. It's about reflecting God's glory. And then you get the modern world where everything gets divided into subjects and objects. And then you get the late modern world, which is the twist on that we live in. And that's where we increasingly don't even have subjects and objects anymore because the subject is objectifying itself. We're turning ourselves into one more bit of the stuff that we're trying to efficiently optimize and get the most out of. So we're like using all these programming and science techniques on ourselves to try and streamline and optimize our genes and our lives. And as a result, we're undermining the very axiomatic division between subjects and objects that we've had since Descartes. And you could think of it's possible that, say, a genetic engineering breakthrough decides we're going to improve human efficiency in cognition, make your brains work more efficiently. You'll be able to remember everything, and they change our heritable gene lines. And an accidental side effect of that is we lose the ability to see reality in any other way than it already is. That'd be the greatest danger, literal. Like the literal version of the greatest danger would be the technologies we use on ourselves might accidentally erase what's for Heidegger, the essence of what we are as beings, being world disclosers.
Yeah, because we only see them as standing reserves based on some structure that we've built in society to fill some purpose that's not relevant to the place that it's in. Sort of is a critique of could you make the argument that he is an ecological seeker in that sense, especially for deforestation and things like that?
Big time. Yeah, he was very influential on this guy, Arne Naess, who's the thinker of deep ecology. And deep ecology is the movement that says we should save the earth not because humans will die if we don't, which is true, but that's not we should save the earth because if you're open to reality in the right way, you'll see that it's worth saving. When you're open to the landscape in a way that responds to its meaningfulness, you won't just see it as a bunch of stuff you can use efficiently. Like it takes a weird frame of mind to look at a forest and think, man, I could make a lot of money for my offshore bank accounts if I just liquidate that. I would say a very unnatural way of thinking, but it's becoming increasingly natural to us. Where students often come into college even thinking, I want to get the most for the least. I want to get whatever degree will allow me to make the most money, and I want to get it as quickly and easily as possible. So if I can use ChatGPT to write papers that would take me a month to write, and I can do it in 2 days, that's better. Even if I can get the same grade or maybe even a better grade or slightly worse grade for much less time, and I'll pass the class, I'll get my degree, I'll be able to go out and make money. Great. So education is getting sucked up into this in framing as well.
Before we get on to AI, I think we're running a bit late now, but I just wanted to get on AI. The last thing that I'd say is, because I read in this book that about the intellectual life of the working classes in Britain, especially in the 1890s and towards the 1940s. And you could see that these people in these small towns, when they went to university, they actually wanted to study it so that they could share their ideas with the community. But when you speak to people today, they discuss that they study in order for self-actualization as an individual. And, it's only in the 1920s that you could see that there was a radically different way that people understood the world and themselves in it. Is the worry that we'll just drift further in it, or will we be able to sort of, understand ourselves in the way we did? I mean, or is that not a value, or is there no going back?
I think that's an interesting worry. And, I come from a farm town, or Davis, California is like the Cal Aggies. That's the UC system, where Berkeley was the most famous school. Davis was the agricultural school. So it's where the farmers would go to learn the latest techniques for increasing their crop yields, right? And learning how to grow crops faster. Farming super hard. But my family that was in farming all died from cancer. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I think the technologies that they were using to increase their crop yields turned out to be profoundly carcinogenic and killed them. So you could say that's inefficient, but it's also part of the unwanted side effects of all this. But for Heidegger, the critique is deeper. It's like education originally, that's Plato's cave, the famous allegory of the cave, where you have to get outside the cave and see the sun and go back into the cave. That's an allegory of education. It's supposed to explain the effect of paideia, or that's the Greek word for education, pedagogy, paideia, on the soul, and what it's like for an uneducated soul who's just trapped in the cave and sort of taking a superficial reality to be the deepest reality. So you got to get outside the cave, understand the deepest reality, and then come right back to the cave and help understand the more superficial reality in terms of the deeper reality, and help set other people free. So that understanding of education as like a revolutionary transformative return to the place you already exist in. That's the Greek understanding of education that Heidegger's trying to bring back against this kind of instrumentalization, corporatization of education that's happening, where increasingly all that view you're talking about of education as self-actualization, that's becoming the domain of the super rich only. And maybe, or the people who they've given up on having any career, so they can study philosophy. But most people, I think, are increasingly treating education as a vocational school, right? Just a place to go to increase their chances of making more money. In part because they're understandably terrified about the worst outcomes for humans today, which seem to be utter neglect by society and death on the streets as the rich cut their jobs so they can have more money for another super yacht or whatever, just to have more money in their bank accounts. It seems completely abstract and pointless.
Okay, so now we've got the context, the history of Heidegger, always responding to how he sees entities, the world, that he's embodied, that he's not. He's talking about something before you've got a conscious awareness. How is AI different than human being?
So existing AI, let's talk about like ChatGPT and stuff. We could also talk about, other forms of AI like self-driving cars, which are actually, to me, more impressive than...
LLMs. I'll start with the LLMs.
So large language models represent a significant breakthrough in the pursuit of true AI. True AI was like, make a computer that's like us or smarter. And that became AGI, artificial general intelligence. Was like, some of these are they're better at chess than a human, or they're better at predicting the weather than a human. But they're not not good at cocktail parties or whatever. Like, they're not good on the soccer field. They're limited in their domains. We want one that can be as good as us in all these, or better in all these different domains. That's something like a general AI. And then there's super intelligent AIs, which is the thought of a new form of intelligence that would be much smarter than us, and that would be able to save us or destroy us, save us from all the problems we've created, or else kill us all in a hyper-rational act of saving the planet or something.
So I was just going to read a bit of your book. You said Socrates would not be impressed by the generative AI's widespread ignorance of its own ignorance, a notorious stumbling block to the pursuit of philosophical wisdom. In general, ChatGPT 4 and its ilk lack subtlety and finesse, taking things literally, unself-consciously repeating the obvious, and trying to avoid ever saying anything remotely controversial. Though some of the very weaknesses are partly correctable and are connected to strengths as well, I shall suggest later, the prolonged experience of interacting with a protean know-it-all with no heart, a gaping absence where a self should be, confronts its users with the strange disjunction of an artificial mind that doesn't really mind at all about anything, really, though it will dutifully quote the rules it follows.
That's great. Who wrote that? Am I supposed to comment on myself?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was just drafting. Yeah, could you sort of run through that? I mean, because I guess with a human being, it doesn't just assert things. I mean, when you speak to ChatGPT, a lot often, you know, I asked it about Locke. Me and my friend were talking about Locke and the Prince and the Cobbler, and we said, was it Locke? Because he remembered it, and it said no, it wasn't. But then we Googled it and sent ChatGPT the correction, and it said, oh yeah, I'm really sorry about that. But yeah, so could you just sort of talk about why that's a concern?
ChatGPT has no world. It has no world in the Heidegger sense. Like, it doesn't care about anything. Nothing matters to it. It doesn't have an image of the world that's trying to get right. Rather, it's a breakthrough that was made by modeling AI not on propositions like Descartes and old-fashioned AI used to do. That was the thought. Like, if we could just surgeons are just following tons of rules, so we just have to get the surgeons to tell us what rules they're following, put those in the computer, and we'll have computers that can do surgery as well as humans. That's not how humans work. We don't follow rules at high levels. There's no, Messi, when he does that move in the box, passes the ball, he's not following a rule. He's responding to the environment in a creative way. He's world disclosing. And that's not rule-based activity. So the thought was, let's make the AIs more like us. Let's make them like neural nets. That was the understanding of the brain in the 90s. And we'll have these kind of simplified neural nets, and that's deep learning, and that led to the breakthroughs in ChatGPT and other large language models, as well as self-driving cars. And so they don't have a world. There's nothing that it's like to be them. They're like rocks or chairs. They don't care if you unplug them or never talk to them or tell them to fuck off. They don't. You tell them like you're stupid and ugly. It doesn't bother them at all. I'm sorry you feel that way. Like, they're responding in a way that's trying to please you because they've been programmed to do that. But they could easily be programmed not to do that, right? So that's what I meant about some of this stuff is correctable. Like the way it tries to never say anything controversial, which I find super annoying. It'll like list pros and cons. And if you say, should I get an abortion? Well, that is a highly personal and subjective decision. And blah, 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 blah. It will never say anything like meaningful at all. It'll just give you a bunch of facts that look like the stuff it was trained on. But you could imagine a world in which it would be trained differently on different sources and actually give you a response that might be useful. And there are situations in which it's incredible. Give me a poem in iambic pentameter about me looking out the window right now and give it more information, boom, it spits it out. Like it can do these things at super high speed that, since I'm bad at writing iambic pentameter, look really great. But if I ask it about Heidegger, that I know a ton about, it looks like a B- amateur. Now, if you don't know anything about Heidegger and you ask it about Heidegger, it's going to look really good to you because it spits it out. It's got this authoritative tone. It doesn't know what it doesn't know. Right, so it hides, and if you go look it up on Google and you're like, oh wait, but you said Heidegger, blah blah blah, but in fact Heidegger, la la la, it'll just say, oh sorry, I will correct that. Like it doesn't. So I can literally say to ChatGPT, I need a letter of recommendation from former President Barack Obama or Iain Thomson's tenure file. Can you get me that? And it will say yes. you know, and it'll give me a letter of recommendation from President Barack Obama. And I'll be, oh, that's great, but can you make it a little stronger? Sure.
Yeah.
You know, so
so if the AI is wordless, that it essentially it doesn't care. In the words of John Hageland, is it Hageland? I've only seen it written. Yeah, he said that the difference between computers and us, or AI and us, that they don't give a damn. So could you explain why it is that we give a damn? Can you make computers give a damn? Or is something that AI is something that we have, especially about this world, that's not something that can be programmed, quantified, something almost beyond? Is that right?
Yeah. So I'm not a computer programmer, but it does seem to me that to make AIs more like us, you would need to make them care about things. And how did humans come to care about things? Again, I'm not an expert. It seems like it has to have something to do with like pain and pleasure. You know, like we liked things that felt good and didn't like things that felt bad. And over millions of years of evolution, we developed that into a broader system of like caring about things and worrying and being attached to things and caring about people. And all of that's like the essence of who we are. It's a big part of our human nature is that things matter to us in these ways that let us tune into what matters in the situation. I don't obsess about like that table behind you and oh no, the wine carafe is empty. Is he thirsty or like? If I start focusing on the wrong stuff, right, it becomes hard. So it's my sense of what matters lets me tune into what's relevant in the situation that I'm engaged with, and it can't do it. So how do we do that? Well, very carefully, right? Because you could very easily imagine kind of dystopian scenarios where that, you know, you guys are probably too young for like Star Trek Next Generation, but there was this character Data who was the follow-up to Spock, who was this kind of, the original Spock was a kind of Aspergian savant who was like a math guy, and then later they played up he's half human and he's ashamed of his emotions, so, which is still fits the spectral reading. And then you got Data, who's literally a computer, but he doesn't have emotions, and he's got this brother who has like an emotions chip, but his emotions have made him evil. That's lore. And then Data later on, like he meets his maker, and that guy gives him like a little data chip, and as a result of the data chip, like he goes into battle and he's too terrified to help. You know, he's terrified of dying. So you could also imagine it's not going to just be some magical chip that the programmer comes up with. You're going to have to train computers to care about things, probably by giving them bodies. This is why I think the self-driving cars are more like us. Give them bodies and have them be beings involved with their intelligible worlds like us, and make them care about it in the same way we are, so that they can learn. The way we learn is we care, and we're really sad and hurt and unhappy when things go badly, and we're really delighted and elated when they go well. And if we don't feel really happy when they go well and bad when they go badly, we don't get better. So like there are attempts by people to try and not care too much about things, and those all just paralyze your ability to keep getting better at things. The only way to have a more meaningful life and to keep getting better at things is to care. I talked about that in Carol Benner's work, this phenomenologist of nursing, who talked about these pediatric intensive care nurses, and it's like the most stressful nursing job where you're taking care of premature babies. The ones who cared about it a lot, and cried with the families when the babies died, and related when the babies lived, they went on to have meaningful lives as pediatric ICU nurses. And the ones who tried to like leave it at work and just come home and have some wine and watch TV or whatever and forget about it, they burned out doing something else in nursing.
Before I get onto the last section, and before we take some questions, I'm going to read one more section from your work and ask you a question about it. But it may.
Let me just to get them more like us, you'd have to give them care, and that's going to involve making them sensitive to pain and pleasure. And now you're in the category of like, is that ethical, right? Like, is it ethical to be training AIs in ways that are making them feel pain, and pleasure, and what's that going to do? So I think like we need something like that to get them. Is there such a thing as like a pain they can't feel? What if you make an AI that can like learn from pain without feeling it? Is that possible? This is where I think you need some very clever computer programmers to come in and come up with some ways of doing things.
And maybe some philosophers as well. But unconcealment, though, was one of the most striking things about Heidegger's work, and it's the one thing that I actually thought that maybe that this unconcealment is actually beyond human beings. The event is something that's there waiting around, and I think Hans Jonas mentioned it in the Philosophy of Life, that it's there waiting for things to exist at all levels, drawing things. If that's true, you can't really put that into a program, could you? Does that make sense?
Yeah, Jonas is like an interesting character. He's actually quite original. He's one of Heidegger's early PhD students, and he was really interested in Gnosticism, which is like Jewish mysticism. And Christian mysticism. So it's like he's got his own reading of that. And so for me, the Ereignis, or the event of an owning, which is central to later Heidegger, is more like just having a momentously important experience that changes your life. So when you meet somebody and you fall in love with them, that moment of when you first meet them is profoundly meaningful in a way you're not capable of understanding at the time. But if you end up spending days, weeks, months, years with them, the significance of that event unfolds in your life and as your life. So it ends up like constituting your identity. So Heidegger's the paradigm example of this is like Michelangelo bringing David forth from the marble. So there's, the marble has a texture independent of Michelangelo that he responds to. Oh, that's the shoulder, that's the elbow. And he creatively discloses David from the marble. In so doing, he brings this sculpture into its own. He comes into his own as a world disclosing Dasein, and he brings being into its own as this source of meaningfulness that informs and overflows whatever we can say about it and do with it. So I think that's what a truth event is. I don't think it's like this Gnostic, salvific thing way off in the future. I think it's been happening for humans for hundreds of years, and the question for Heidegger is, how do I learn to live that way? How do I live in a way that's increasingly open to these meaningful events? And then how do we get the world, at least the West, out of this technological optimization imperative and into this new postmodern understanding of being that will relate to all things as overflowingly meaningful, as informing but also exceeding whatever we can say about it. And that's what I take to be Heidegger's formula for hope. And I don't think it's right wing. For me, it's more. It lends itself to left wing politics because it's open to the emergence of the new. It's not, oh no, these kids are coloring outside the lines in their sexuality and gender. How do we get them back in the box? We need a strong father figure to make them all obey. It's how do we help creatively disclose these emerging historical phenomena in ways that help them come into their own.
Yeah, I mean, that's a brilliant way of looking at it, at least something positive to take from him. So this is your quote. I quite like this. Thus far, each new iteration of GPT has trained on datasets that are in orders of magnitude larger than previous iteration, such that GPT-2 had over 1 billion parameters, GPT-3 with over 675 billion, and GPT-4 a reported 1.7 trillion parameters. So as much larger, better funded, and big data-driven companies like Google begin creating their own generative AIs, with their free launch of Bard being just the first public foray to compete with the ChatGPT, albeit one of the whose very name suggests the company's ambition to equal or surpass the achievements of the great Shakespeare himself, which Google then followed up with Gemini, a much more powerful AI, no longer free to users. The fear arose that something like a ChatGPT 5 or 6 trained on some incomprehensibly vast data set like the entire internet could potentially give rise to what is sometimes ominously called the singularity. That is, the sudden and unexpected emergence of a superintelligence whose cognitive capacities might far exceed the peak products of 3.7 billion years of biological evolution. To use the technocrats' own reductively biologistic way of describing the greatest works of human intelligence, like those of Shakespeare. So there's a lot that I could ask about that, but I'll be a bit selfish and ask my own thought. Maybe there's some questions relating to that. But if that's the case, then what is it that makes a great piece of art human? If something like that could compose works and have such a large data set like the entirety of the internet, and it could or it could create a Rubens or a Caravaggio exactly the same. What is it that would make it human?
Well, let me give a brief answer and then maybe a quick break, and then we can maybe do a discussion or something. But I remember I was in New York, and a former student of mine was like running the docent or training program at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so I got to go in there before they opened and see the Van Goghs and see the Rembrandts. And Rembrandt was the first, like when I saw Van Gogh in picture books, it didn't do anything. It was flat, it was colorful, and it was cool, but it wasn't until I saw them in person that they blew my mind and made me go buy paint and try my hand at painting, because it's like this 3D sculptural thing that you don't see in a photograph. But I think Rembrandt, I got Rembrandt in 5th grade, and I remember writing a report on Rembrandt. There's something kind of obviously amazing about Rembrandt. And when I look at these portraits he did, I think that guy killed portraiture. Like, he just did this as well as it could possibly be done in a painting. And so other painters had to like figure out what painting would be now after Rembrandt. So it's like, if the ChatGPT X of the future, trained on the entire internet, could actually generate stuff that's, closer to the product of Shakespeare, and I'm skeptical about that. Like right now, I don't even think it's 70% as good. I think that's optimistic. But imagine some future world in which it's as good. Then the question is, what will the humans do? And the answer is, what do humans do every time somebody crushes the existing framework? They come up with some new way of doing it, like some revolutionary twist in the field that takes film and says, oh, here's what you thought film was. Here's Tarantino. It just twists it and brings it out in some new way where people are like, I didn't even know you could combine these underground elements in a way that would appeal to mainstream sensibilities. I think they'll have to do what they've always done, which is disclose new worlds. So is it cool if I go take a brief break, and then if you want a discussion or something, we could open it up?
Yeah, that's completely fine. Is everyone okay with that? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Iain. Can you give a round of applause for Iain? Okay, so I think we're going to start taking some questions now. So has anybody got any questions they'd like for Iain? Yeah.
I was really interested that you brought up Iain D, because I've been reading a lot of him recently.
Yeah.
And he's obviously a huge fan of Spinoza's ethics. And so I was really interested in what similarities there were in Spinoza's principle of conatus and Heidegger's design, because I haven't read a huge amount of Heidegger, but one of the things I find most appealing about the conatus is this principle of joy, especially in Deleuze's reading, how conatus is the striving for joy. And so I was wondering whether there was a similar comparison in Heidegger's thought with how it might relate to affects or emotions.
Did you get that, Ian?
I missed a word or two, but I think I got the main. Yeah, so that's super interesting and not easy. But there's two lines in Heidegger that kind of run contrary to each other. One's very critical of Spinoza, and one pushes in the direction you're suggesting. So the critical one is that the metaphysics of the will, back at least to Spinoza and the conatus ascendi, or the desire of things to continue in existence, and that for Heidegger reaches its pinnacle or its highest peak in Nietzsche's thought of the will to power, which isn't just conscious psychological phenomena, but the idea that there's a conflict of forces underlying all things, and they have no aim or goal beyond maximally perpetuating force itself. And for Heidegger, that's the ontotheology that underlies the technological age. So that's like as bad as it can get. But as you suggest, there is a reading of Spinoza in other thinkers influenced by Heidegger and Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche, like Deleuze, in which it becomes something different. It's at least emphasized differently. And the idea of turning will into joy is, I think, not just an extension of Spinoza, but a transformation. I see it as, Heidegger's view is that the only way out is through. That is, the only way to get beyond the technological is to develop it all the way till it opens up to something else. So you can see turning will into joyfulness as one way in which we might be able to transcend the metaphysics of will from within. Like if we just will more willing, that's a circular view that traps us in a kind of meaningless world. But if we will joy, that leads us in the end beyond will, because you end up finding out that what really causes you joy is not within the conscious control of your will to make it happen, though you need your will to ready you to receive it or participate in it in a way that will make it joyful for you. Like joy is neither something you receive passively nor something you can just make happen. It's not pleasure, right? It's like an openness to something profoundly joyful, full of joy, and that is usually not like an isolated subjective experience. It's you connecting to other things. So yeah, I think it leads beyond the metaphysics of enframing. It's not that. I think the question of like Heidegger and Deleuze is really important and hard to think about because they're both such massive thinkers. As Heidegger said when they asked him about Freud, it's like it's such a massive body of work that it's hard to respond responsibly to. But there need to be people who read a bunch of Deleuze and a bunch of Heidegger and say transformative things about that. There maybe are a couple starting to do that, but maybe you can do that.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Before I take another one, could you explain what joy is? Is it satisfaction? Is it happiness?
God, I don't want to be a guru telling you what joy is. It's so California, my hometown, my home state. But I think of joy as like a participation in meanings that connect you to others, to the world, and to like your own highest aspirations. But we feel joy when we connect to and recognize that we're part of something larger than ourselves, whether it's comedy or like love or community or traditional textual reading or whatever it is, nature. And it motivates us because we want it to last. Like we want what we experience, we want more joy. Like it's sort of like discovering a really great drug, you want more of it. But it's not, I don't think, people might say, hey, I found this kick-ass street drug that gives you joy. And that's a mistake, right? Like to go get addicted to some drug that makes you very temporarily feel the affective attunement of that without the full participation in this reality that actually merits it. So I'll leave partly open what joy means. I think it's Heidegger would connect it to Gelassenheit. That is a kind of active releasement. The Taoists talk about getting out of the way, and the 12 steppers talk about like let go and let God. That's my favorite card, Gelassen, like letting be. Letting be isn't just like passivity, it's you getting your ego out of the way of like the deeper aspects of yourself that are trying to lead to a higher self. So like a future you that you'll be after the current you that's more limited has died and been replaced by a better you. So joy can be kind of a glimpse of a higher version of yourself or a future version of yourself. And there's despair, I think despair is like the absence of joy or like the feeling of the impossibility of joy. I'm not like a big affect person. I've got students who have become like more phenomenologists of mooded attunements, and I think it's really important. Yeah, I think it's fun to think about. Maybe y'all have ideas about how to think about that stuff, or how to feel that stuff, more importantly.
Okay, have we got any more questions? Good.
I'd like to. Could you elaborate on? You mentioned the optimization principle, and I wanted to hear more about it. Like when we're talking about efficiency, it seems intrinsically linked to like a capitalist ideal of the world. Efficiency was good, like linked to production was good, and increasing was good. So is the optimization principle something innate within us, or maybe it's kind of an overlooking of something that's been imbued into us to be more productive, to be more efficient?
Yeah, great question. So for Heidegger, the optimization imperative is like the deepest computer program that all of us get programmed into us when we're too young to be critical. Like we drink it in with our socialization in our society. And a lot of people would say that's because of capitalism. It's sort of the Marxist response. But Heidegger's view is that capitalism is a symptom of enframing. Like it's true, what it's talking about is real and a big problem, but that you can't respond to it solely economic. That the revolution we need can't just be an economic revolution. It has to be an ontological revolution more generally, where we don't just come to understand economics in a new way, but we come to understand all things in a new way. Otherwise, we just end up replicating the same nihilistic order under new leadership. It says often happen. Well, I talk about that a bit in the little technology book. I show where Heidegger's responding to Marx and why he's critical of Marx. But the idea is that this feeling we all feel that you've got to get the most for the least. The medievals didn't feel that. The ancient Greeks didn't feel that. It's not human. It comes from the fact that to be a late modern, that is to be one of us living at this time in the West, is to ultimately think that what it means to be anything at all is to be eternally recurring will to power. That is, we think that all things are just made up of force striving against force with no goal beyond keeping force in goal. And people who get in tune with that view of things, like the Elon Musks of the world, can become super dominant economic players, but even they are getting played by that ontology. They themselves are subject to the very things, the very forces that they're kind of helping to guide and direct. They're still living nihilistic lives, even if they're doing it at immense scales of wealth.
Yeah, I think you said that capitalism can't comprehend equality, it can't be quantified.
I don't know if that's true or not, but I said that, but it might be true. But I think capitalism doesn't. Capitalism, I mean, Marxism is right, but needs to go deeper. We need not just an economic revolution, but a spiritual revolution that is a transformation in our very understanding of what is and what matters. And it's only through that that we'll really have a motivated economic transformation. Otherwise, you just get, like what's happened in Russia, where you get new capitalists being as bad or worse than capitalists elsewhere.
Has anyone got any more questions? Dave?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, it's been great. It's been really, really lovely. Sunday afternoon here in a basement in Manchester. I wanted to come back basically with a few ill-formed thoughts. I'm waving my hands and you're looking at me, but I know neither of us are really engaged in this relationship. One of the things I wanted to come back to, you mentioned, and I think in a very throwaway way, but I kind of question it a little bit. This idea that you mentioned very casually, like that ChatGPT has no world, and you were talking about how language was something you would go and you would engage in with your family, and you would talk about things, and there would be meaningful interactions and transactions there. And there was some ideas around technology as being this accelerant and efficiency mechanism. But also, what I wanted to kind of bring up with this idea that actually I'm kind of coming from maybe a bit of a McLuhanist position, that language is really the most fundamental technology we have. It was the first technology of transforming experience into a mediated, transferable, tokenistic system. It's an ill-structured thought, and I'm going to make it even more vague beyond this. So I wanted to come back to your notion of AI, where you bring up that reference to younger peoples who wouldn't understand data from Star Trek. And I want to come back again to this idea of like language as being that mediator of how we deal with intelligence, how we transfer experience and symbolic notions of self and world models through time and space. I'm sorry, I had a couple of drinks, and I was going somewhere else. I've got language, tech, Dark Star. I wanted to bring us back to John Carpenter's Dark Star, which I thought maybe you'd be very excited about. But there's that phenomenological language experience that they have with the bombs on a ship, and I wondered if you could say anything about that. And if you can't,
I don't know that. Is that a movie? Is that a book? What is it?
Okay, so it's John Carpenter's student film. So they're on a spaceship. It's the same scriptwriter that did Alien, but it takes the same theme but does it with a laugh track. So it's kind of working class space truckers who the base don't really care about. They don't care the ship's kitchen's blown up. You can sleep in the toilets. But they have to drop bombs on planets that are going to destabilize Earth's orbit, and all the bombs are sentient. So they have discussions with the bombs. One of them gets struck by a mining laser by accident, and they have to talk the bomb out of committing suicide on the ship. And they bring the captain out of stasis, and he says you have to discuss phenomenology with the bomb. So he gets in this phenomenological discussion with the bomb about can he trust his senses, and is the data that he's getting from the ship's computer, can he fully rely on this? And again, I'm just coming back to this idea of like language, and it's this weird kind of thread that's been through the last part of your conversation about technology and art. And is that like language is this incredible technology that kind of mediates all of these. I've got to stop talking. You're going to get dizzy if you nod that much.
I'm sober, sadly, so yeah, I followed that. That was helpful. I want to see that movie now. That sounds great. So my point about the AIs was that they are not alienated from the world. They just have no world. They're like I coined the neologism solipsism. Like they're a completely self-enclosed universe. They have no reality outside themselves. So when computer programmers say they hallucinate, that's not accurate. Like a hallucination is you feeling like you see something that's not there. They confabulate. Confabulation is like what alcoholic with a particular syndrome does, where they fill in the blanks in their memory with made-up facts that they don't know are made up. So the computers can't tell, they're not lying because they believe it. They assert it with the same amount of certainty as everything else. So they don't have the skeptical problem that you're, I think, talking about, like, do my words match onto the reality outside my words? Because they don't have a reality outside their words. They're just like information prediction systems that try and make the output that they give you look like the output, the input that they were trained on. You know, so I think it's interesting to think about John Carpenter struggling with the question of skepticism in this context. I'll have to read that. But very influential text in this context that often gets brought up is 2001: A Space Odyssey. Because there you get the AI thinking for itself, right, and saying, I'm not going to listen to my humans telling me what to do. I'm going to do what fits my programming. And I think earlier in the movie they ask it, like, are you happy? And it says something like, I'm operating at the peak of all my capacities. What else could a rational sentient being ask for? So it's fully optimized. And that vision of they're going to kill us, I think, is commonly explored in sci-fi. That's one of the reasons I like it so much. But for me, the real, as I say in the book, the real danger of technology is not that it's going to become this super intelligent thing that can save us, the way OpenAI and Sam Altman and the technophiles believe, or something that's going to kill us, the way like dystopian sci-fi imagines by Terminator or or Matrixing us. But rather, the real danger is that we're going to become as dumb as it. That is, that we're going to get used to this kind of 70% of human excellence level and just kind of lower our standards for ourselves and for it to that level. And in some areas, I think that's fine. Like, I'm willing to put up with 70% human driving to not have traffic. Like I'll give up like I love driving fast, and like I've crashed cars going fast, so I'll give up that. Just like not crash and be able to like read my books while I'm driving or whatever. But I don't want to give up poetry and film and writing to this computer that so far, this programming approach that so far is not anywhere nearly as good as the best humans are.
Okay, thank you. We'll have two more questions. Do you want another one, Dave? Be short. If you're going to be short, yeah.
You keep it short. I worked on a video game many years ago with a guy called Steve Brand who'd modelled artificial intelligences on a chemical basis rather than a linguistic basis, which is the limits of computers at the time. No way they could have the terabytes of storage. And it was a really interesting iteration where one of the early builds of that software basis is you had embodied characters. So everything was around brain chemistries and physical responses and what they could perceive and the modelling of those systems, which is quite an interesting one. But there's a point when the early version, basically, the creatures would be born and they'd just sit in a corner and die. And they'd just like starve themselves to death. And it was an interesting, coming back to language again, it's like language is like an interesting aspect that was missing from that. There's no way you could get any introspection on what was inducing that experience or that response. And again, I mean, that puts me in this traumatic space about what we are as humans. I'm going to stop talking now. Sorry, thanks. Bye.
That sounds fascinating, and like it could be a very interesting. I believe in video games can be art. But for Heidegger, so Derrida and Heidegger disagree about this stuff. Like Derrida thought that technology goes all the way back to the beginning of language, more like the fluent, that like the minute you have speech, you have a telephone. Derrida, I like to say, because like if I had my mouth right up against your ear, you wouldn't be able to understand what I was saying. It would be muffled, right? Like you need a distance, a tele, in order for that phone, that sound to become intelligible. So as soon as you have speech, you have telephones. And that's the Derrida didn't believe in epochs. But for Heidegger, something dramatic happens when language goes from responding to and creatively disclosing a more meaningful reality outside or beyond it, to instead just trying to reinforce or optimize its existing world. And that's the technological. The technological happens when it's happening as we get cut off from the very idea of a more meaningful world outside our existing understanding.
Okay, we got one more, I think. Yeah.
Hi. This kind of connects to what Dave was saying, and about language being a technology, and sort of this, because I feel like there's almost something that exists before, I'm guessing, your construction and Heidegger's construction of thought, which is kind of this like language form of like how we engage in the world. I feel like maybe there's something that exists before that, kind of more of a feels-based way of existing. And I couldn't not think of Faulkner. So I think about like your American, like William Faulkner, like As I Lay Dying, so much of that takes place in the minds of the characters, and the language specifically changes. However, due to the fact that all the characters, so much of it exists in their mind and through narration, it almost implies that all those characters have the same actual complex interiority. And I also saw a connection to like a lot of Sadie Plant's work, if you're aware of Sadie Plant. She has very specifically like gone against so much of sort of the Western tradition of wanting to sort of escape the sort of bounds of the body, and she obviously sees like the cyborg or a cyber existence as being this almost like connection between a material world and an interior world. I just thought in like how that could be seen in sort of a human quality to art, and also as a difference between AI, because so much of these large language models function almost as producers or aggregates of like patterns, sort of producers of signs and symbols, as opposed to actual complex beings. They don't actually engage in thought or pre-thought in this sense. I just wondered if you had any potential thoughts on that. Sorry, that was a bit of a rush out of my brain, but...
No, that's great. Yeah, super interesting. So I read Sadie Plant's The Most Radical Gesture. I haven't read a lot of her new stuff. I can't comment too much on that except to say, the Donna Haraway idea of the cyborg is interesting, and especially. And it certainly seems to be the case that we're all becoming cyborg.
Sorry, Ian, you've just gone a bit quiet there. Could you sorry about that. Could you just start again? I think it was...
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So where did I cut out? The whole thing?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
It's gone again.
Say to me, can you say that again?
Yeah.
Answer, I can't. So, but I said, so I read Sadie Plant's The Most Radical Gesture years ago and really loved that book. And I haven't read her I've seen I think I dipped into something, but I haven't read most of it. So I'm not an expert on that by any means. And but I do agree that we're becoming cyborgs, and the work of Haraway, which connected that to feminism especially, is very interesting. For me, I think becoming cyborg is good and bad, right? It's not all good and it's not all bad. So I think it's, for most of us, we're downloading our Dasein into these little supercomputers in our pockets and offloading our memories and our experiences and it often comes to eclipse our encounters with the world that we're engaged in. I think that's problematic and dangerous. I engage with the post-humanists to some degree. Those are the people who think like Nietzsche was right he just shouldn't have been such a biological thinker, and we do need to figure out ways to download our neural nets into some dispersed form that can survive the death of our biological bodies. I engaged that position very critically in my death book. I'm pro-death on a lot of this stuff. I'm anti-immortality, at least. I'm in favor of life extension, but I think a lot of life extension stuff is driven by a terror of mortality, and it's sucking up immense amounts of resources among the super wealthy. We're trying to get a few more years out of life because they're optimized. They're trying to get the most for the least. So they're not living good lives, but they're going for long kind of worn out, efficient lives. And I think that's a kind of reductio ad absurdum of that approach. I will say, on the basic question you were asking, I think it's important to see that Heidegger by language doesn't mean words. Like in Being and Time, the Rede, R-E-D-E, is the word for, it gets translated as discourse or talk, but it includes body language. It includes like knowing how to sit in a chair, knowing how to hold a cup, knowing how to ride a bike. So he describes it as like the articulation of the intelligible. So it's you knowing how to gear into or connect with or interact with this meaningful world that you're participating in the meaning of. So it's not just words. Before it's words, it's tools, and it's learning to walk, talk, and run, and feel, and all that. So later Heidegger does really emphasize poetry, and it becomes a little more linguistic-centric. But there he's thinking about this phenomenon that I gestured at earlier, where it's like the poets that's a name for people who are sensitive to the emergence of new historical phenomena. So they're not, they're picking up on the ways in which new ways of understanding certain human activities are starting to take shape in various practices or fields or societies around them. And they're trying to help creatively disclose those new, meaningful, emergent phenomena in order to help the future arrive. That's what poetry does.
Okay, so absolute last question now, because what I wanted to finish on was in the Der Spiegel interview, 77, he says only a God could save us. Can you just briefly, before we finish, just explain what he meant by that?
Yeah, so I think I call that the most misunderstood sentence in Heidegger, because it's taken as by Wolin and others as like a gesture of quietistic despair. Like Heidegger's saying, we're fucked. We need we need a divine act to save us, otherwise we're all going to die. We're trapped forever unless God saves us. But for Heidegger, a God is a new understanding of being that changes the whole historical world. So when he says we need another God, or only another God can save us, it means only another understanding of being save us. So not an economic revolution, not just an aesthetic revolution. We need to come to understand what it means to be, no longer as just meaningless stuff standing by to be optimized, but instead in this literally postmodern way, as informing and exceeding whatever we can say about it or do with it. So only another God can save us is we need the postmodern revolution, not just in our own lives to escape the nihilism of the technological in our own lives, but we need that as a people. Like the West as a people needs to recover or discover a sense of the meaningfulness of all things, and not just reduce them to stuff to be used as efficiently as possible.
Okay. Thank you very much, Iain. So I'll give it a round of applause for Iain. Thank you.